The clatter of silver on porcelain was a language Kaya understood. It spoke of impatience, of dissatisfaction, of wealth so profound that politeness was an optional accessory. At Aria, a restaurant where a single plate cost more than her week's rent, every sound was a signal. Tonight, the signals were all bad. Her manager, Richard, slid up beside her at the service station, his smile as thin and greasy as the film on an old fryer. Table 7, Kaya. Our special guest, Chloe and Brianna, their aprons impossibly white, snickered into their hands. Kaya didn't need to look at the reservation book. Table 7, the secluded corner booth with a view of the entire dining room, was reserved only for him. Mr. Kwon, the man who owned half of Koreatown and, rumor had it, the darker parts of the city, too. He was also, as Richard liked to announce with theatrical pity, profoundly deaf. I thought it was Brianna's turn, Kaya said, her voice low and even. She kept her eyes on the dining room, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. Change of plans, Richard purred. Brianna felt you'd be a better fit. Show some initiative. The words were a shove disguised as an opportunity. It was a humiliation ritual. Every new server had to take Mr. Kwon's table. They would try to speak to his stone-faced interpreters, get flustered by his complete lack of response, and inevitably screw up the order. He was known for his cold dismissals, a silent flick of his fingers that could get a person fired. They wanted to watch her fail. They wanted to see the quiet, competent black girl who never complained finally break. Kaya picked up her notepad. She straightened the spine of her vest. Of course, as she walked toward the table, she could feel their eyes on her back, burning with cheap malice. The air grew colder as she approached. Mr. Kwon was not a large man, but he occupied space with an unnerving density. He was carved from stillness, his black suit tailored with surgical precision. At his shoulders sat two men, identical in their severe expressions and the watchful emptiness of their eyes. Mr. Kwon himself was looking down at the wine list, his focus absolute. The line of his jaw was sharp enough to cut glass. She stopped at the edge of the table. One of the interpreters looked up, his expression a flat wall of dismissal. He was about to speak, to become the barrier between his boss and the world. Kaya ignored him. Her gaze went directly to Mr. Kwon. She took a breath. Then she raised her hands. Her movements were clean, precise, a language learned over years of watching her own grandmother navigate a silent world. Good evening, she signed. My name is Kaya. I will be taking care of you tonight. The effect was instantaneous. It was like a string had been pulled taut in the silent space around the table. The two interpreters froze, their professional blankness cracking into disbelief. Mr. Kwon's head snapped up. His eyes were not black, as she'd expected. They were a deep, dark brown, the color of wet earth at midnight. And for the first time, they were focused entirely on her. They held no warmth, only a sharp, analytical intelligence that stripped away her waitress uniform and saw something else underneath. He stared at her for a long, heavy moment. The restaurant's ambient noise, the distant murmur of conversation, the faint chime of a glass, faded into nothing. There was only the charged silence between them. Then his hands moved. They were beautiful hands, long-fingered and elegant, but they moved with the same lethal precision as the rest of him. You speak the language of the quiet? He signed, his expression unreadable. Kaya kept her own expression neutral, though her heart was hammering against her ribs. I do.
Why?
It was not a question of idle curiosity. It was a demand,
a test.
My grandmother, she signed back, keeping it simple. She taught me. He considered this. His gaze swept over her once more, lingering for a fraction of a second on the worn collar of her shirt, the faint line of exhaustion under her eyes. He saw everything. A flicker of something unidentifiable passed through his eyes before the cold mask settled back into place. He signed again, a single, sharp gesture. The Chateau Margaux, 1982, and bring me the menu. Not this one. He tapped the leather-bound book on the table. The real one. Kaya nodded, her hands falling to her sides. She turned and walked away, her back straight, her steps measured. She did not look back at Richard and the others, but she could feel the heat of their shocked silence. The game had changed. She had walked into their trap and found a door they didn't know existed. What she didn't realize yet was that the door didn't lead out. It led further in. The rest of the service was a silent ballet. She moved around the table with an economy of motion, her hands speaking a language only he truly understood. She described the chef's specials, the subtle notes of a sauce, the texture of a proposed pairing. His interpreters sat like statues, rendered obsolete. For the first time, someone was speaking directly to him, without a filter, without the slight delay of translation that always kept him one step removed from the world. He watched her hands, but his eyes kept finding their way to her face. When the meal was over and the table was cleared, he did not leave. He simply sat, watching her. Finally, he gestured for her to approach. His hands moved slowly this time, deliberately. "You are wasted here." It wasn't a compliment. It was a statement of fact. "It pays the rent," she signed, a truth so plain it felt like a confession. "I pay better," he signed back. "You will work for me as my interpreter." Kaya's breath caught. The air in her lungs turned to ice. This wasn't a job offer. The way he looked at her, the absolute certainty in his posture, made it clear. It was a declaration of ownership. She had made herself visible to a man who lived in the shadows, and now he was pulling her in with him. I have a job," she signed, her hands trembling slightly for the first time. His eyes narrowed. "You had a job. Now you have a position. My car will be outside for you at 11. When your shift ends. Do not be late." He stood, a smooth, silent motion. His men rose with him. He gave her one last look, a look that sealed the transaction, and then he was gone, leaving a vortex of cold air and the heavy scent of cedar and smoke in his wake. Kaya stood frozen, the ghost of his command hanging in the air. Richard rushed over, his face a mess of confusion and fear. What did he say? What happened? She looked at her manager, at the petty cruelty in his eyes, and then at the other waitresses, their jealousy now curdled with apprehension. They had wanted to see her humiliated. Instead, they had made her indispensable to the most dangerous man they had ever seen. That was the moment everything changed. She told herself she had no choice, that survival meant obeying. But deep down, a colder, more honest voice whispered that she was also curious. She had spent her life being invisible, and Mr. Kwan had looked at her, had truly seen her, like no one else ever had. At 11 o'clock, she walked out the back door of the restaurant, leaving her old life behind, and stepped into the waiting black car. The door closed with a solid, final sound, sealing her in. The world of Kwon Jin, as she came to know him, was a world of silent, brutalist architecture and unspoken threats. His penthouse was a cage of glass and chrome perched high above the city, its windows looking down on a world he controlled but never seemed to touch. Her life became a series of silent meetings in stark boardrooms, tense dinners with men whose smiles never reached their eyes, and long, quiet hours in his presence. She was his voice and his ears. She translated the nuances of a rival's threat, the sycophantic pleas of a subordinate, the cold finality of his own orders. She learned to read the subtle shift in his posture, the slight narrowing of his eyes, the almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw. These were his real language, and she became its most fluent speaker. He was a creature of absolute control, his days scheduled to the minute, his emotions locked behind an impenetrable mask. But she started to see the cracks. She noticed the way he would stand by the window at night, his reflection a ghost against the sprawling city lights, his shoulders carrying a weight she couldn't yet name. She saw the way his hands would clench ever so slightly when the name of his younger brother, Min-jun, was mentioned. The danger she had only sensed before became real 2 weeks into her new life. They were leaving a late meeting, walking through the echoing concrete of a parking garage. The air was damp and smelled of gasoline. Kaya felt it first, a shift in the atmosphere, a prickling on her skin. Jean felt it too. He stopped, his head tilting. His hand shot out, grabbing her arm, his grip like steel. He pulled her behind him just as the first shot rang out, the sound a deafening crack that ricocheted off the walls. Concrete exploded from a pillar next to her head.
He didn't hesitate.
He shoved her down behind the solid base of the pillar, his body a shield over hers. The world became a storm of noise and chaos. Muzzle flashes lit the dark garage in strobing, violent bursts. The smell of gunpowder was acrid in her throat. Pressed against the cold concrete, with his body a warm, solid weight against her back, she felt his breath, hot and controlled, against her ear. He wasn't panicked. He moved through the violence like it was his natural element, a language he was born speaking. His men returned fire with disciplined efficiency. The gunfight was over in less than a minute, ending with a squeal of tires and then a profound, ringing silence. Jean didn't move for a long moment. He remained over her, a living wall between her and the aftermath. She could feel the steady, powerful beat of his heart against her shoulder blade. In that silence, under the flickering fluorescent lights of the garage, the world shrank to the space between their bodies. It was the most terrifying and the safest she had ever felt. He finally pulled back, his eyes scanning the garage before they landed on her. He looked her over, a quick, intense search for injury. His hands came up, signing with sharp, angry movements. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, her own hands too unsteady to answer. He saw her trembling and his expression tightened. He reached out, his fingers brushing a piece of concrete dust from her cheek. The touch was brief, almost accidental, but it sent a jolt through her entire body. It was the first time he had touched her with anything other than command or urgent protection. It felt like a brand. That night, back in the silent fortress of his penthouse, she couldn't sleep. She found herself in his study, a room lined with books he couldn't hear read aloud but whose stories he consumed with a voracious appetite. On his desk, tucked beneath a heavy paperweight, was a framed photograph, turned face down. Her hand moved before her mind could stop it. She turned it over. It was a picture of a younger Jean, his face less hard, a ghost of a smile on his lips. Beside him was a woman with fierce, intelligent eyes and a confident laugh. They looked like partners, equals. Her name was Hiren. The voice was not signed. It was a low, rough sound, gravelly from disuse. Kaya spun around. Jean was standing in the doorway, watching her. He rarely spoke, preferring the precision of his hands. The sound of his actual voice was a shock, an intimacy she was not prepared for. He walked over to the desk, his eyes on the photograph. He picked it up, his thumb stroking the glass over the woman's face. He began to sign, the story pouring from his hands with a raw, painful clarity. She was my partner. In this life. She understood the risks. She was better than anyone. Faster.
Smarter.
He paused, the silence in the room heavy with the weight of his memory. My brother, Minjun, he was ambitious. Reckless. He made a deal with our rivals to take my territory. Hiren trusted him.
He was blood.
He used that trust to set a trap for her. Not for me. For her. He knew taking her from me would be a wound I would never recover from. His hands stopped, his fists clenched at his sides. I was too late. I found her after. He took her from me because of who I am, because of a loyalty she believed in, and he betrayed. He looked at Kaya then, and for the first time, the mask was gone. She saw the wound he carried, a deep, isolating shame. He had built his silent empire on a foundation of control to ensure he would never fail to protect someone like that again. And by bringing her here, into his world, into his line of fire, he had put her in the same position. She could have left. In the chaos of the garage, she could have run and never looked back. The police would have been a way out. But she had stayed. She had gotten back in the car. And standing here, seeing the raw pain he kept hidden from the world, she knew she wasn't going to run now either. She made a choice. She stepped forward and placed her hand gently over his, which was still gripping the frame. She didn't sign anything. She just stood there, her touch a silent acknowledgement of his pain. A promise. He didn't pull away. The silence between them was not empty. It was filled with the story he had just told, and the one they were just beginning to write. The dynamic between them shifted. It was subtle, a current running beneath the surface of their silent interactions. He started seeking her out, not just for interpretation, but for her presence. They would spend hours in his study, him reading, her working on his correspondence, the quiet companionship of fragile truce in his violent world. He caught her watching him, and she caught him watching her. A glance held a second too long, a shared look across a crowded room. It was a conversation all its own. The test of this new, unspoken alliance came during a meeting with the heads of his organization. One of his lieutenants, a man named Park, was on his knees in the center of the room, accused of leaking information to Min-jun's new allies. Jean stood over him, his face a mask of cold fury. The verdict was already decided. Kaya could see it in the finality of his posture. Park was going to die. From the edge of the room, Kaya saw Park's wife, a woman who had always been kind to her, her face pale with terror, her hands clasped in a desperate prayer. Something inside Kaya snapped. She couldn't just stand by and translate the man's death sentence. As Jean signed the order, a brutal, unforgiving command, Kaya took a breath and began to interpret for the other men in the room. But the words that came from her mouth were not his. She twisted the command, weaving a lie. She made it sound as if Jean had uncovered evidence that Park had been framed, that the real leak came from a rival faction, a man named Cho. She named names, dates, locations, details she'd gleaned from documents she'd organized for Jean, information she was never supposed to have pieced together. It was a colossal gamble. The room held its breath. The other lieutenants looked from her to Jean, confused. Jin's eyes, which had been fixed on Park, slowly lifted to hers. The look he gave her was terrifying. It was pure, distilled rage. He knew instantly that she had betrayed his words, that she had manipulated his command in front of his entire organization. For a heartbeat, she thought he would expose her, that he would sign the truth and have them both killed. But he didn't. He held her gaze, a silent war raging between them. She saw the fury, but underneath it, she saw something else. Calculation. He was weighing her lie, its plausibility, its usefulness. Her fabrication was good. It protected his authority while redirecting the blame toward a known enemy. He gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod. He turned to his men and, with a flick of his wrist, dismissed Park. The lieutenant scrambled away, saved from execution by a lie. Kaya had crossed a line she could never uncross. She was no longer a bystander. She was a player in his game. Later that night, the storm broke. He cornered her in the library, the rage he'd suppressed earlier now rolling off him in palpable waves. He slammed a hand against the bookshelf next to her head, trapping her. "You defied me," he signed, his movements fast and sharp. "In front of my men. You risked everything. Why?" His face was inches from hers. She could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, the faint scar that cut through his left eyebrow. She smelled the cedar and smoke of his cologne, a scent now inextricably linked with danger and safety. She refused to look away. Because it was the right move, she signed back, her hands steady despite the tremor in her soul. Killing Park would have shown weakness, an inability to control your own house. This way, you look strategic. You look like you are 3 steps ahead. "I am always 3 steps ahead," he shot back. "I do not need your help." "Don't you?" The challenge was out before she could stop it. He stared at her, the anger in his eyes warring with a raw, undeniable something else. He was a man who lived in total silence, surrounded by people who feared him, who only heard what he wanted them to hear through interpreters. She had not only spoken to him directly but had dared to speak for him, to alter his reality. He leaned closer, his voice a low, dangerous rasp that vibrated through her bones. "You are the single most dangerous thing that has ever walked into my life." He didn't sign it. He said it. The words were for her alone. And then came the confession, dragged from the depths of his guarded soul. He signed, his hands moving slowly now, the anger replaced by a stark, terrifying honesty. Before you, the silence was just empty. Now, it's loud. It's full of everything I should not be feeling. She felt her own confession rise in her throat, just as honest, just as dangerous. I told myself staying was about survival, she signed. I was lying. The space between them crackled with tension. It was no longer about employer and employee, about protector and protected. It was about two people who saw each other with a clarity that was both a comfort and a threat. The consequences of her lie came swiftly. The rival faction, now believing Jin's organization was targeting them based on her fabricated intelligence, decided to strike at his most obvious vulnerability. Not his money, not his soldiers, but her. It happened on a rare afternoon she'd taken for herself. She was leaving a small bookstore downtown, a place that reminded her of a life before all this, when a black van screeched to a halt beside her. Two men jumped out. She didn't have time to scream. She ran, her heart pounding in her ears. She used her knowledge of the city's alleys, a map of survival learned from years of poverty, to her advantage. She dodged and weaved, knocking over trash cans, creating obstacles. She managed to lose them, collapsing in the back entrance of a busy restaurant, her lungs burning. But the message had been delivered. She was no longer just a witness to the war. She was a target. When Jin's men found her, she was sitting on the curb, shaking. Jin himself pulled up moments later. He got out of the car and came to her, his face carved from granite. He knelt in front of her on the dirty pavement, his expensive suit forgotten. His hands gently cupped her face, his thumbs wiping away tears she hadn't realized she was crying. His eyes were blazing with a protective fury that was more potent than any declaration of love. He didn't have to say a word. She was his. And someone had just made the fatal mistake of trying to take her. The final confrontation was inevitable. Jin knew his brother, Min-jun, was behind the attack. He was pulling the strings of the rival faction, using them to finish what he had started when he betrayed Hyrin. Jin prepared for war, a quiet, methodical gathering of his forces. He intended to leave Kaya secured in the penthouse, protected by a team of his most trusted guards. She would not have it. "You need me," she signed, confronting him in his office as he studied a schematic of a warehouse by the docks. "I'm not a liability. I'm an asset. You are a target," he signed back, his expression resolute. "I will not risk you." "You'll be going in deaf and blind," she argued, her hands moving with fierce conviction. "Your men follow your orders, but they can't tell you what they're hearing. The scrape of a shoe, a whispered warning, the click of a gun's safety in the next room. I can," she paused, then played her final card. "And I know something you don't." She had seen the address of the warehouse before, in a file detailing Min-jun's acquisitions. But she had also seen architectural plans for its renovation, plans Min-jun had commissioned before his betrayal. He had intended to turn it into a legitimate front. She had memorized them. "There's a maintenance tunnel," she signed, spreading the schematic on the desk and tracing a line with her finger. "It runs from the adjacent property and comes up behind the main office. He won't have it guarded. It's not on any of the official city plans." He stared at the line she had drawn, then up at her. He saw not fear in her eyes, but a steel resolve that matched his own. She was not asking for permission. She was stating her terms. In her, he saw the same fierce loyalty and intelligence he had lost in Hyrin, but it was different. It was sharper, tempered by a world that had tried to grind her down and failed. He had tried to keep her separate from his world, but she had woven herself into its very fabric. He gave a single, decisive nod. "Stay by my side. Always." The raid was a symphony of controlled violence. They used the tunnel she'd shown him, emerging into the heart of the enemy's den. The fighting was brutal and close quarters. Kaya stayed glued to Jin's back, her eyes and ears his, signing quick, silent warnings. Two left corridor. One above on the catwalk. He moved with lethal grace, a predator in his element, his actions seamlessly integrated with her intelligence. They were two halves of a single fighting unit. They found Minjun in the main office, using his last remaining soldier as a human shield. He saw them, and a cruel, triumphant smile spread across his face. He shouted at Jean, knowing his brother couldn't hear the taunts. Kaya signed his words for Jean. He says he should have killed you years ago. He says you were always weak. You let love make you weak. First with Hyrin, now with her. Minjun's eyes fixed on Kaya. He can't protect you any better than he protected the last one. But as he spoke, his focus shifted for a split second. It was the opening she needed. Kaya wasn't a damsel waiting for rescue. She stomped down hard on the foot of the man holding her, driving her heel into his instep. He grunted in pain, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was enough. She dropped, twisting out of his grasp and rolling away. That single, decisive action cleared Jin's line of sight. The conclusion was swift and silent. The threat was neutralized. In the ringing silence that followed, surrounded by the aftermath of their war, Jin walked to her. He ignored the bodies, the blood, the arrival of his cleanup crew. He saw only her. He pulled her to her feet, his hands checking her for injuries. A cost had been paid. 2 of his best men were down. A stark reminder that victory in this world is always paid for in blood. But she was safe. Back in the penthouse, the city lights below seemed distant, belonging to another world. The danger had passed, but nothing would ever be the same. He was who he was, the silent king of a violent empire. And she, a waitress who was supposed to be a victim, had become his queen. He turned to her, the hard lines of his face softened in the dim light. He didn't offer apologies for the world he had dragged her into. He didn't make promises he couldn't keep. His hands came up, and his confession was simple, absolute, and more powerful than any vow. You are my voice, he signed. You are my stillness. You are my quiet. It was everything. It was an acknowledgement of what she had become to him, no longer deniable, no longer hidden. He was a man who had lost his partner to betrayal, who had sealed himself in a fortress of silence. She had breached his walls not with noise, but with understanding. She did not sign back. Instead, she stepped into his space, rose on her toes, and pressed her lips to his. It was a kiss that was not about passion but about acceptance. It was a choice. His hands came up to cup her face, his touch no longer a question or a command, but a claim. He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes.
Stay, he signed.
It was the same word he had used that first night, but it meant something different now. It was not an order.
It was a plea.
She answered by leaning her forehead against his, her choice made not in a moment of duress, but in the quiet aftermath of the storm. The silence that enveloped them was not an absence of sound. It was their language, their sanctuary, their home.